Now we come to the central section of the book of Revelation, 15 chapters of pure apocalyptic, with all of its strange symbols and pictures, some of them even bizarre. Because this is a new section, we're going to take a little longer than our usual 10 minutes, because we need to do some introduction. To understand apocalyptic literature, you've got to have a bit of background, a bit of understanding of the genre. It's the same when you look at a Picasso painting. You've got to have a bit of understanding of history of art, of Impressionism or Cubism. This painting is called the Guernica. It was painted after the horrors of the bombing of civilians in the town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War in 1932, in an era where bombing of civilians was still considered an atrocity. Now, there are many symbols in this painting I just don't understand. I don't understand what the bull stands for. I don't see any emotion there. I don't know why the eyes are crooked, something that Picasso did a great deal. But I certainly get the drawing of the woman holding her dead child with her head thrown back in utter agony, pleading as it were to the skies, but getting no answer. I understand the soldier lying at the bottom in death throes, and his sword is broken, perhaps a symbol of the futility of war. And I understand the horse with his agony. It reminds me of what Romans says, that creation groans together with what mankind does. And his eyes are totally disorientated, perhaps a picture of the utter disorientation that human beings throw on nature because of our violence. I don't understand the symbol at the top. Is that meant to be an eye, an all-seeing eye? Or is it meant to be the sun throwing light? But then it's only got a naked electric bulb in the middle, suggesting the light that we have is very poor. I don't know, and we'll never know, because Picasso refused to discuss his symbolism. He wanted rather people to work it out for themselves. And in that way, it's very like the book of Revelation. Now, it's really important that we decide what kind of book Revelation is. There are some people who think it's a chronological book of prophecy. So John is standing there looking into the future, and he sees near and then he sees further. In chapter 6, he might be talking about Domitian, who will be dead in 96 AD. Perhaps in chapter 13, he's looking forward to Adolf Hitler. Surely he was the great beast. In chapter 19, perhaps he's looking at the second coming of Christ. Chapter 20, the millennium. A chronological prophecy. This is what is called dispensationalism. Now, I want to show you why I don't think that's the right way to look at the book of Revelation. We've already seen that these chapters of John are made up of 7 cycles, and they are cycles. They're almost like a wheel going around. Each one of them starts with a description of terrible tribulation. Then they come to judgment on the wicked, and then they come to restoration. And some of them then have a little interlude before the next cycle. Now that is repeated 7 times over. Now there are clearly not going to be 7 judgments, and there's certainly not going to be 7 second comings of Jesus. So what I think is happening here is John is looking out across the world and the future, and he's seeing the same thing 7 times from different angles. Some of it is future, but some of it is just describing the world as it is now. And so we begin. We start with chapter 6. And bear in mind that today we're only looking at the first half of the first cycle. There was a movie called A Million Ways to Die in the West. It featured our own Charlize Theron. Isn't she beautiful? But in a way, chapter 6 could be called A Million Ways to Die. Or perhaps more accurately, 4 ways that millions of people have died, because there are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Notice that when each one of the 4 is called out, it's preceded by a voice from the throne saying, "Come," as if these evil forces that wreak so much damage are under the beck and call and under the control and permission of the throne of God. And in the midst of all the evil in the world, it's good for us to remember that. I watched as the Lamb opened the first seal, and there was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a tyrant bent on conquest. Notice that he was given a crown. All these tyrants only have their power, but by the will of God, and they will lose their power. This is death by tyrants. Men who gain military power and decide to try to dominate the world. And how many deaths have they caused? Alexander the Great, who conquered the whole known world by the age of 33 and then wept that there was nothing left to conquer. He caused the death of 142,000 people, 142,000 who were never allowed to live out their lives naturally. But that pales into insignificance before the death toll in the Roman war against the Jewish revolt, which took place just 40 years after Jesus predicted it would, AD 66, and it ended in AD 132. 2 million people killed. It was the first case I found of more than 1 million killed in a single war. And a large number of those were Romans. The Jews fought like terriers. But when it was over, there was barely a single Jew left alive in Palestine. But that pales into insignificance before the name of Genghis Khan. Now, we don't know much about Genghis Khan because he was in China and Iran, and that's not our world, is it? Genghis Khan was responsible, we believe, for 40 million deaths. And what's really spine-chilling about that, that was before the day of explosives and machine guns. Those 40 million were killed hand to hand. And then we come to the 20th century. What a century. In the First World War, 16 million killed. And the awful thing about that was how many of them were young men. But in the Second World War, the king of all wars, we believe over 60 million people died because of a triumvirate of tyrants who wanted power for themselves. Then the Lamb opened the second seal, and a fiery red horse came out. Its rider was given power to make people kill one another. Notice that this rider doesn't have a sword because he doesn't need to do the killing. He kills by persuading people to kill one another. Death by civil war. The American Civil War was a terrible thing. The Red Horse inspired 750,000 Americans to rise up and kill each other. You know, that was more than all Americans killed in all other wars, from the War of Independence through Vietnam, including the Second World War, rose up and killed each other. But that's nothing compared to what I want to show you now, and I hope this keeps you awake at night. We've seen that in the 20th century there were 76 million killed in the 2 world wars. Do you know how many people were killed at the hands of their own state, at the hands of their own government in the 20th century? 170 million people. That's approximately the population of the entire earth at the time of Christ. Death by civil war. The Lamb opened the third seal, and there was a black horse. A voice was saying, "A kilogram of wheat for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil or the wine." This is a black horse, I think, because he's almost invisible in the dark. He doesn't have a sword. He kills by words, and his words are to inspire people to underpay their employees. This is death by exploitation. When it says a kilogram of wheat for a day's wages, you can make 1 decent loaf of bread for a day's wages. And that's all you will have to feed your family, and families were big in those days. There'll be nothing left over for education, for health, for transport, for clothing, for housing. This is exploitation of the poor by the rich. And what does it mean when it says, do not damage the oil or the wine? Well, oil and wine are luxuries. They are for the rich. And so what the rich is saying, exploit the poor, let them die in poverty, but don't touch our luxuries. Death by economic and social exploitation. The Lamb opened the fourth seal, and there was a pale horse, and its rider was named Death. He was given power to kill by famine and plague. His name is Death. The fourth horse is usually represented by a skeleton. Satan deals in death. The more human beings he can kill, the better he likes it. Perhaps it's because if you don't give people time to live their natural lives, there is less chance to put themselves right with God, as many do towards the end. And a pale horse, that word pale in Greek is the word chloros, from which we get the word chlorine. As we know, chlorine gas is deadly, and it's a ghastly, dull yellow color. perhaps similar to the colour of someone who's dying of liver cancer, if you've ever seen that. He deals in death by famine and plague. Have you ever heard of the Holodomor? The Holodomor was a man-made famine caused by Stalin, and he deliberately directed it against the Ukraine because they were threatening that they wanted independence from Russia. And in the process, 10 million Ukrainians died. So you see, the war in Ukraine right now has got a history, and Putin is doing it all over again. The horror of famine. And then death by plague. This is a picture of the actual bubonic plague bacterium that caused all the trouble, that lived on fleas, that lived on rats, that thrived on dirt, and they never knew. The Black Death caused more deaths than any other plague in history by a long way. They estimate between 75 and 200 million were killed. Notice the variation in that estimate. There were no medical records, very little medical help, and it was utter chaos. And it killed by the million. You could rise in the morning apparently healthy and be dead by sunset. The second worst plague was the flu epidemic of 1918, which also killed between 50 and 100 million people. Notice again how vague that estimate is, but it was terrible. In my own parents' lifetime. Our own COVID, by the way, killed 17 million people, and that is still the 7th greatest plague in the history of the world. It was no plaything. And so the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, 4 ways in which countless millions have died. It's been a pretty morbid Bible study, hasn't it? That's why I'm wearing black. The only bright spot is that we remember that this is only half of the first cycle. But we're going to go out by playing Handel's Funeral March, because it is good for us to mourn and to grieve the countless millions who have not been able to live out their natural lives.